Flora!
I jump as a familiar voice rouses me out of the flashback of memories I had wished to just forget. The return to that horrible place that we had all somehow resurrected from history through our foolish actions of antagonizing a foundation that should have never been tread upon for the entirety of the remainder of history and time. I will never forget the sight of that headless demon and every macabre detail. Her bloodstained fur, her insidious laughter and taunting, and the overwhelming smell of death and copper in that single space. They were all burned into my being, just like the scar from me trying to hopelessly escape before all that had happened could take place. I shake my head, my eyes meeting Sassy's worried gaze in my dark and cold room.
Flora, are you okay?
She says, in an attempt to get my attention. I eventually recollect myself, completely unsure of what had just happened. I'm fine, I answer sincerely. What happened? Did I space off? She wipes her forehead of her growing sweat and sighs in relief at my response. She's absolutely stressed and grateful at the same time as she addresses me again.
Yeah, you just suddenly spaced off and became unresponsive to everything I said. What happened? Did you have a sudden blackout or flashback?
Sassy knows me well. She knows just how traumatic those memories are of that night I spent in a demented Tartarus, and that they can be triggered easily with just a single word. Especially Nightmare Night. This hadn't been my first blackout. I've had several in the long year I've been stuck in this place. And while others claim it is a sign of me losing my marbles, Sassy knows what really is happening. That's why she's my only ally in this fuckhole facility. She actually knows me, and knows that I'm not crazy. It was a little flash. I lie through my teeth. Nothing that hasn't happened before. She puts her right hoof on my shoulder and looks at me with seriousness, not buying my lie. I don't like lying to her, but if I told her what I really saw, I'd be forbidden to join the rest of the facility tonight for the surprise Sassy mentioned prior to my setting days.
You know I'm on your side, right? If you need to talk about whatever is causing these dazes, I'm here to listen.
She reassures me. My heart warms at her kindness, but I can't risk putting her in danger or any chance of word spreading, so I just express a fake smile. I know, but I still need time, Sassy, I reply. It's not a total lie. I really don't have the strength to speak of every raw and horrid detail that occurred that night in Bittersweet apple hell yet. I lost so much that night. Things I can never fix or repair back to working condition. Things that I don't even want to remember. But just like the scars on my hoof from the fence burning me, they are forever burned in my memories. Memories of things I never want to relive, speak of, or even think about to the day my heart finally stops. Sassy smiles in understanding, patting my shoulder lightly and turning to leave my practical prison cell. As soon as the door hisses closed, I return to my bed and attempt to sleep. But the flashback of the horrors of a year prior keep me awake, taking me back once again.
A scream. A violent, piercing scream of anguish was all that had met Flora in her arrival of some unknown part of the Apple family's farmhouse, her left hind leg pulsing with inflammation and pain. Flora had traveled awkwardly, resulting in one of her legs getting twisted, making her an easy and defenseless target for the bloodthirsty mare on the prowl for every ounce of blood pulsing through her body. In other words, she was doomed to eternal torture in whatever Tartarus she now dwelled within. She knew it was bad to scream in her current predicament, but she couldn't help it. She'd never suffered the pain of a fractured bone, therefore, that piercing agony was new to her, and as her leg continued to pulse waves of pain, all she could do was scream. The area she'd arrived in was very compact and dimly lit, the only visible exit being off to the left side of the room between two thick, rusted pipes. The floor was nothing but old, rigid straw that hurt Flora to lay upon, feeling like she were in a bed of needles. The smell of the area was a mix between a musty cellar or attic that hadn't been entered for years, mixed with an overwhelming stench of rot, similar to walking upon a bloated corpse of an animal that had been dead for weeks in the scorching heat of summer. Flora couldn't even smell the reeking scent, too occupied by her injury to even notice the very evident smell. She only cried and uttered the sounds of some pony in excruciating pain, gritting her teeth as she shifted to lay against the wall of her hellish abode. She couldn't walk or even attempt to put pressure on her leg, so she had to drag herself out of view from the only opening in the area. The movement felt like she was dragging a massive block of lead over blazing red charcoal, but she knew she had to at least try something to keep herself safe from the serial killer on her trail. Sitting back against the wall, she lay out her lower body and started to inspect her injury. Upon seeing it, she gasped. The entirety of the lower part of her back left hoof bruised and swollen. The area was a mix of green, purple, blue, and gray, spread out from the bottom part of the leg to just above halfway up, and the entire area was swelled to about the size of a half-inflated balloon. She nearly vomited at the sight, but chose not to, resorting to attempting to calm herself down. Stress and panic would only worsen the injury, so her first step to getting to a point of being mobile again wasn't causing any further unintended damage to her wound. She took deep breaths in and out, wiping her forehead clean of sweat and eyes free of tears. It was a trick she'd learned in her sports medicine class, and with each long breath, she could feel the pain lessening and her nerves slowing their rapid dancing. The pain was still evident, but subtle enough for her to handle with no need to grunt or scream. She was relieved at it, allowing herself to just breathe naturally and regain full clarity on the situation at Hoof. She and the others were in danger, and she had no idea where they were now in this place of unspeakable horrors. She had an injury that limited her movement in the long night still to come, and there was no way to decrease her injury. And most critically, she was being hunted by a psychopathic mare that was out to kill her and her friends and make them personal slaves in this place for eternity. How the hell was she going to survive? Then, out of the mass of pain, doubt, and unadulterated fear clouding every one of her thoughts, some voice of reason spoke out and made her gasp in surprise.
No, Flora. Stop thinking negatively. The best thing you can do right now is not panic and calm down. If you assume the worst, you're dead meat for sure. So I need to clear my head and figure out what I can do to keep myself safe from danger.
She chastised herself in her mind. She took another long and heavy breath, calming herself down enough to be able to think clearly and smartly. She had never been in such a critical situation in her entire life, which was the main reason she'd reacted so negatively. Looking around and thinking hard about her situation, she knew that one thing was for sure. and that was that in order to survive, she was going to have to push herself harder than ever before. That included putting herself through excruciating pain in order to stay out of harm's way, and that thought alone made her nauseous. She'd seen this kind of stuff in horror movies before and never thought she'd possibly end up in a situation like what those movies portrayed, but she couldn't deny her harsh and cruel reality, and knew that she'd have to get back up and fight through her injuries' constant waves of pain at every step and trot. Staying there and crying like a fool would only end her life all the more faster, and she knew it.
Fuck my life.
Grating her teeth and lifting herself up from the needle-like straw stabbing at her skin, she carefully got herself back onto her hooves. Upon the slightest pressure to her wound, she nearly lost all of her balance, the waves of agony feeling as if she'd just been struck by a taser gun. Her stomach churned at the electrifying pulses radiating from her leg at an incomprehensible speed, her vials starting to slink up her throat, and the nausea increasing with every second as she attempted to breathe normally. It felt as if she were lifting a 1,000-pound lead anvil as she put one of her spasming legs forward, grunts and heavy breaths escaping her mouth through her still gritted teeth with each movement.
One step at a time, Flora.
With one leg forward, she started with another, feeling her wound pulse like a second heartbeat and her sight being obscured by fragments of her unfurled bangs. She still pushed forward as hard as possible, her opposite non-injured back leg following her motion and dragging along the hard ground. It felt like forever, but Flora eventually succeeded, moving on to the next pair of legs. Once her injured legs started to move, she nearly lost all of her progress, a muffled yelp escaping her throat and stopping behind her snow-white teeth. Tears met her eyes, leaking down her face and dripping onto the floor of rotted straw. Moving her wounded leg was the equivalent of feeling as if some pony had stuck a heated knife through her leg and had just left it there to torture her, and she could barely resist screaming in agony at the agonizing sensation. She breathed as if she'd just finished a marathon, saliva starting to fall from her mouth now.
Just power through it, like ripping off a band-aid.
Her self-encouragement was enough to push her past her much evident agony, closing her eyes and dragging her leg forward again. That same stabbing feeling plagued her senses and nerves yet again, but despite her leg feeling as if it were being shredded apart through a wood chipper, she pushed through it, eventually coming to the point of where she'd successfully taken one whole step. She wanted to smile at her accomplishment, but knew she couldn't stop now, building up the courage to take another set of steps. While it was excruciating to do it, it was the only way she'd be able to build up the ability to move throughout this maze of whatever in Tartarus existed in this demented farm or slaughterhouse.
Okay, Flora. Me go again. And I did go again. Up until I could finally walk normally and the pain had become second nature. It was as if I had relived my process of learning to walk as a fool. Only instead of balance being my enemy, it was a constant pain that made the term a thorn in my side literal. Unfortunately, doing that ended up fucking my leg up. Seeing I stressed a fracture with so much pressure that it made the injury heal abnormally. To put it simply, the bone hadn't been able to heal back to full strength because of improper treatment. And even now it continues to break over and over. I lost count at 50 times, and due to it happening so constantly, any more pain is nothing more than the equivalent of a pinch of a syringe. So I guess you can say that means I'm the only pony to not ever flinch when a bone breaks. A grim but relieving fact about myself that I've come to accept. However, her broken bone is mild in comparison to what followed my amateur rehabilitation. Saying that Hell Maze was big is an insulting understatement. No. The correct terminology for that place is more along the lines of gargantuan, colossal, endless, eternal. Not to mention what had occurred within it can only be described in a few select words, but the two that come to mind the most are malefic, sinister, and demonic. But the one word that I can say describes it all is the only reason I still even remember the events of that night, minute for minute, detail for detail, and word for word. That word is traumatizing. And the traumatization only started when I found Trevor. Little did I know it would be the last time that I would ever see him again.
Flora had wandered for what felt like hours of going in a circle, nothing but the sight of large rusted pipes and the lingering smell of mold and rot to accompany her entire trek. Any trace of pain had all but faded in her back leg, and she was thankful that some mysterious god with a forgiving heart had spared her further dread. However, that didn't extinguish the clear fear that was creeping through every bone in her body at the lack of any sign of additional occupants within this monolith of a maze, causing her heart to ache at the possibility that her closest friends may already be eternal occupants of Sweet Apple Hell. She didn't even want to think that possibility could be true, but she had to come to the full realization that this place wasn't fantasy or anything like her world. This place was alive and truly evil, its life force kept alive by the blood and fear of any pony who dare enter its domain. Reality and logic were irrelevant here, and its demented leader was no exception. She still struggled to believe that she'd seen a headless body speak words from a non-existent mouth and walk straight as if it could see clearly. Her heart had sunk at the sight of the infamous cutie mark of 3 red apples, having to blink twice to be absolutely sure what she had seen was real. Her injury was real. The danger was real. The demented mare that had been beheaded by Crimson Flash 20 years prior was alive and as lethal as she had been when she and her family still had reigned over Ponyville. Every one of her beliefs about the tragedy that Princess Fleur had attempted to bury with all of her grief had been proven true. The Bittersweet Apple Massacre had occurred in history, and just as Crimson Flash had stated, instead of learning from the past, Ponykind, by burying a horrid truth, had been doomed to repeat mistakes. It's exactly why Flora and her friends were currently fighting for their lives, and it was only their fault for meddling with a greater force than they could have imagined. Rounding what felt like the billionth corner, Flora came to a larger opening, glowing an eerie yellow light. As unsettling as it was, Flora actually felt like she'd made some progress in this endless labyrinth of horrors. And upon walking into the massive opening, her ears perked at an eruption in the silence. The sound of a muffled cry. Flora's heart skipped a beat at the sound, the voice sounding more feminine than that of a male stallion or, sickeningly enough, colt. The cry seemed higher than any sound Sarah could produce, but Flora wanted to be absolutely sure, working toward the sound's source. It came from the far side of the area, eventually leading Flora to the far north wall. Flora had heard that victims of the Apple family had been found within walls as stuffed trophies upon the full investigation of the farmhouse, and that sent shivers down her spine. Luckily, she found a handle that slid open the wall upon scaling the wall for anything to allow access to the victim. Sliding it open, she was met with a single wall, where a lone mare hung on the wall. Upon closer inspection, Flora nearly lost her stomach, 4 large and rusted nails being the only thing holding her to the wall. Streaks of dry blood stained her fur from down where her hooves had been impaled with the nails, along with large trails of blood visible from the inside of her mouth, staining her lower jaw. The rag covering her mouth was stained with tons of her crimson life support, and her eyes were bloodshot and swollen from Celestia knows what. She had a messy mane of blonde, stained with coagulated blood, dirt, and whatever else her torturer had stained her with, and her light pink fur that covered the majority of her body reeked what Flora assumed was a mix between death and piss. She looked horrible, and upon her noticing Flora, it was clear that her voice had long since faded away after screaming and begging endlessly to nothing but the rotted wood and creaking pipes. Her voice was only a raspy croak that resembled the sound of some pony taking in a long and weak breath. It was just audible enough for Flora to have caught, but only that and nothing more.
Shh, shh, shh. I'm going to get you out of here.
Flora informed low enough for only her and Jane Doe to hear, starting to look around for something to dislodge the nails. She eyed her surroundings carefully, only to find no tool to remove the nails, to which she cussed in her mind at, knowing the only tool she had that could potentially work was her teeth. The thought of pulling an ancient nail from a gory wound didn't even cross her mind as she positioned herself at the mare's uppermost legs first, digging her muzzle into the clearly infected flesh wound and working to grab the nail head with her front teeth. The mare grunted mildly under the pressure, but allowed Flora to just continue her efforts. Flora mainly focused on just getting her teeth on the nail head, eventually managing to dig deep enough to grip and start to pull the rusted object from the wound. Blood started to leak from the scabs that had been reopened by Flora's actions, as with extreme force, the nails started to slide from the wound, having come loose from the wall rather easily. Flora wasn't sure if she was just wasting her time, but the fact the fellow pony was in disarray and potentially set up for much worse was enough to make her act regardless. At the sight of Jane Doe's leg collapsing from the wall to her side, along with the nail's stiffness dissipating, Flora knew the nail was out. She spat out the nail and turned back to the victim, noticing she had nearly dislodged the other hoof just by the use of gravity. Her body weight leaning forward had nearly been enough to pull her other leg from the wall, to which Flora assisted, grabbing her other front leg and yanking it from the wall. It didn't take much force, the leg falling forward almost instantaneously, Flora working fast to catch the upper body before it fell forward hard onto the floor. She succeeded and lowered the mare onto the ground, surprised that the mare didn't even attempt to stand. Flora didn't object though, assuming the victim was too mentally and physically exhausted to do anything at all. Another clear sign of her exhaustion was the fact that she had barely even jumped or made a noise from the first nail being pulled out, meaning either her nerves were somewhat shot, or similar to Flora's rehabilitation, the pain had just become mute and non-existent to her from the countless injuries she'd taken. It was a sickening thought that she didn't even want to believe true, but as she started on her back legs, coming free with very little effort, it became very apparent that pain wasn't even existent to this poor pony. The nails dug deeper down her legs from her being unable to balance her own body, and she hadn't even flinched or yelped at the newly dug wounds. All she did was emit those same raspy croaks that spoke a story of a broken and forgotten mare that once lived a happy life outside of this place. They sent shivers down Flora's spine each time as she finally managed to free her back legs from the wall, leading her to help her to her hooves.
Miss, I need you to try and use whatever strength you have to stand up against my side.
Flora instructed softly, to which the mare didn't even respond to. Flora tried again, still keeping her voice low enough to not draw attention from afar, only to still receive no response. The mare only continued to stare blankly with her near-dead amber eyes, cloaked with a fog that made her seem dead. Flora still didn't give up, recognizing the behavior as a result of trauma and paranoia, due to the fact that she'd been through Celestia knows how many unspeakable tortures and horrors that would plague any mind with incurable trauma. She tried again, this time putting her muzzle right next to the mare's ear to give her better clarity.
Ma'am, please. We need to move as fast as possible.
She instructed once again, relieved at the sudden action of a flicker of the ear she was speaking into. That followed with the mare's left eye meeting Flora's gaze, and the croaks now turning into raspy grunts, growing in speed with each second. Upon hearing that the grunts were muffled, only then did Flora realize that she had forgotten to remove the bloody rag from her muzzle, working quickly to untie the rag and remove it from her face. However, upon the sight that followed the unveiling, Flora's eyes burst to the size of dinner plates, and her right hoof covered her muzzle in horror. Now she knew why the mare really couldn't say anything. Her mouth was a bloody mess, her gums bruised and swollen, and where her teeth should have been was only sharp and jagged remains of what used to be teeth. However, the most haunting part of the entire display before her eyes was the absence of her tongue, the entire bottom of her mouth being nothing but a crimson abyss. Her tongue had been cut out, ridding her of any speech or voice for the rest of her life. Flora's blood turned to ice instantly, and she quickly lost her stomach on the floor. Never before had she seen something so horrifying and tragic. She'd seen plenty of horror movies and read a ton of horror stories, but this was what true horror was. And immediately, every single fear she'd received from a scary story or movie was extinguished and replaced by this sight alone. Her body excreted all of her Nightmare Night delights violently, up until there was nothing left, and all that followed were coughs.
Sweet Celestia.
That sight would never leave her memories like a tattoo to skin, and as she turned back to the mare, she quickly did her best to recollect herself. She could see tears gliding down Jane Doe's cheeks, to which she wiped away gently and returned to her original goal. However, just as she was about to say something, a familiar, sinister sound met her ears. The same laughter she'd heard upon her arrival there, along with the echo of footsteps. A sound that caused her to gasp in absolute panic, turning her head to the middle of the room where a headless figure stood with their lassos secure around their neck. Bittersweet Applejack had found her, and was there to claim her first eternal torture slave.
Well, looks like I found you, Goldilocks. And here I was thinking that you and your little group of nimwits would actually be challenging for me. Looks like you're just as weak and stupid as the others who have dared to tread here out of curiosity.
Applejack spoke deviously. Another chuckle escaped her lips as she started to walk a little closer, to which Flora just stared in horror at. She was frozen and stuck in place with no idea of what to even do.
I see you found my lovely little pet. Cute, ain't you? I call her tongueless or mute, seeing she started doing everything I said after I shut her little protests and complaints up with just the slightest little yank. Bloody mess it was, but it was worth the effort, seeing I got myself an obedient pet and her lovely crimson life supply made for a large profit. Every pony wins and is happy in the end.
The stories Flora had heard could not ever have amounted to what she was hearing. She was in the presence of a truly dedicated serial killer that put every bit of passion into her craft in the most demented and twisted ways imaginable.
She's fucking crazy. It's like she doesn't even care or think about any ponies except herself. Like she's not incapable of emotional regret. I need to run.
But where could she run? There was only one way out, and it was blocked by the psychopath now less than 10 yards from her. Her eyes searched for another alternative exit, but there was no other possible way or opening within the room. What was she going to do?
No way out, Goldilocks. Especially if you still plan to go through with your pointless effort to save that lost cause. She was caught and bound here a long time ago, Sugar, and saving her is nothing more than adding extra weight to your back. She's already dead and trapped forever, and soon you will be too.
She was no more than a foot from Flora now, and the evident smell of copper and rot was enough to tell. The sight of the headless monster appeared like a human to an ant from Flora's perspective, and it was intimidating beyond belief. She knew she needed to run, to do something, but she couldn't move and felt as if she were frozen in place like a concrete statue. The shadow of Applejack now blanketed her body under the dim lights, and all she could do was close her eyes and pray to wake up in her bedroom to the sound of her clock alarm any second.
It's just a bad dream. 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 It's just a bad dream.
Welcome to the slaughterhouse, slave.
She awaited some sort of agonizing pain to purge her body, her eyes still shut and her voice quivering in absolute fear. Every sound seemed to fade away like the end to a music track, essentially putting Flora into a state where her mind had become a dark and eternal void, something she assumed as purgatory or limbo, up until something broke her from it.
Flora, get up! We've gotta go!
A voice shouted in pleading. The voice was familiar, and as all sound returned to her, it was clear who she had heard. Opening her eyes, she saw that Applejack had been attacked by Trevor, and he had her in a momentary stun.
Trevor? Where did you go?
Flora, we need to go! She's not going to be down for long. We need to put some distance between her and us.
He yelled bluntly, grabbing her hoof and pulling her up hastily. Flora caught the urgency, but despite the urgency of the situation, she couldn't just leave Applejack's pet to suffer.
I can't just leave her here. She's a pony too.
Flora objected, pointing to the floor. Trevor grunted at that, having just heard the truth about said mare from Applejack's own mouth while eavesdropping just out of view.
Didn't you hear her? She's already unsavable, Flora. We can't save her, and unless we get out of here, we're next.
Flora frowned, holding her ground in retort.
I'm not leaving without her, Trevor. Any pony can be saved.
Not here, Flora. This is beyond our power.
My mind is made up, so either leave or put her on your back. You have plenty of strength to carry her.
Trevor couldn't win, so with a very audible grunt of annoyance, he made his choice.
Ugh. Fine. You win, Flora.
Quickly, Trevor lifted Jane Doe up onto his back and settled her to where she wouldn't fall off. Then he turned back to the exitway and signaled Flora to start running. Flora listened and took off as fast as possible, taking off back into the labyrinth. She made it around the first corner up until a sudden scream made her stop and skid to a halt. She turned around to where she could see the wide opening again, but what she saw immediately brought tears to her eyes and caused her stomach to turn. Trevor was stopped in place, and from his back up the entire back of his neck had been impaled with hundreds of thin crimson strands, breaking through out from the underside of his body. Massive amounts of his blood was already pouring onto the floor from his hundreds of wounds, and all Flora could do was stare at the sight that had been caused by her and her only. Trevor mumbled in pain, frozen in place from the hundreds of piano string-like strands that had him pinned. All he could move was his eyes, meeting Flora in a stare that only spoke one thing.
Run.
He mumbled before all of the strands simultaneously shifted and ripped Trevor's stock and muscular body into nothing but chunks of pony meat of several different sizes. Flora screamed instantly, her body being showered in Trevor's blood and her emotions going into a spiral of chaos as she followed Trevor's last request and ran like hell back into the labyrinth.